Okay, so welcome once again. Warm welcome to our webinar today. I'm Karima, I'm the European Coordinator of the United Religions Initiative, URI, and I'm your Zoom host today. Baraza and URI Europe, we are delighted to offer the webinars in partnership, commemorating the United Nations World Interfaith Harmony Week. So we'll have the honor today to listen to Professor Dr. Douglas Pratt on Christian Islamic relations, and then we'll have time for conversations. And as already asked, we'd ask you to mute yourself during the talk so that we don't have side noises and it's easier to hear. And later for the questions and answers, we'll invite you to unmute yourself or use the chat function. Also, you can use the chat function throughout the webinar. And I'd like to invite everybody to use the chat to write in where you are calling from. And you can also share your organization or website and your details, anything you would like to share. So last but not least, we find it important that we offer you webinars that you find useful and you are enjoying. So we'd like you to ask you to answer 2 questions, and I'm announcing them now so that at the end of the webinar, we'll ask them again and we'll give you a little bit of time, a moment to put in the answers into the chat. So it'd be great if you can note down the response to that question. Those 2 questions. So the first question is, tell me one thing that you appreciate, that you find useful about today's webinar. Could be one word or a phrase. And the second one is, tell me one thing that you will do as a result of today's webinar. And that could be as simple as telling about it to a friend, or it could be an activity that comes out of it for you. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Riaz from Baraza.
Thanks, Karima. Thank you for your welcome. Good evening, colleagues and friends. To one of you, I wish you good morning. And that is, of course, our keynote speaker. Douglas, great to have you with us. Really, really pleased that you are able to contribute today. Thank you to all of you for being with us for this webinar series to mark World Interfaith Harmony Week. We have organized this program in partnership with URI Europe. I am Riaz Ravat, the Secretary General of Baraza, which is an independent international non-profit organization founded in 2017 in Munich in Germany. Now, Baraza means council or meeting place in the Swahili language. A Baraza can be an informal meeting or an official council. It is a place where people from many different backgrounds meet to chat, exchange ideas, and to solve problems. Baraza's work is expanding all the time. We were responsible for the concept, planning, and delivery of the exhibition, Tolerance, Understanding, Coexistence, which is the Sultanate of Oman's message of Islam. This global initiative has been touring the world for more than 10 years. We've been present in 40 countries and have built up good relations with many individuals and organizations to promote an international mindset based on tolerance in all areas of culture, religion, and understanding among nations. Douglas, of course, that's where we met. We first met now nearly 4 years on, nearly 5 years even. Please do follow us on Facebook and Instagram. On our website, which is www.baraza.ngo, you will be able to download a free interfaith resource for children. And here it is. Our coloring book for kids on world religions is available in many different languages. I also encourage you to use the chat facility this evening. Just to repeat what Karima said, we want these webinars to be interactive and thought-provoking, and please do right away. Baraza is a subscription membership organization, and I extend the offer of membership to you. If you are interested, please do email us. It is my honor to welcome our speaker, Professor Douglas Pratt, for this webinar. Douglas Pratt is Professor of Religious Studies at Waikato University in New Zealand and holds appointments as Adjunct Professor at the University of Bern in Switzerland and Adjunct Associate Professor at Monash University in Australia. a former president of the Australian Association for the Study of Religion and the New Zealand Association for the Study of Religions. Professor Pratt is the New Zealand Associate of the Australian-based UNESCO Chair in Intercultural and Interreligious Relations, Asia Pacific. He's also an associate of the Centre of the Study of Religion and Politics at the University of St Andrews in the United Kingdom. Douglas, the warmest of welcome to you all.
Thank you very much. I'll go to my screen share so that you can see something which is appropriate. The first thing is, thank you for the welcome, Riaz, but obviously the bio notes you got are a bit out of date. I finished at Waikato about 2.5 years ago, and I'm currently a Honorary Professor at the University of Auckland, and also, as you mentioned, Adjunct University of Bern. Those are the main things, but the other things were more or less correct, except for the Australian links have now finished. Anyhow, other than those kind of little factors, I guess whenever I get introduced and hear these things, I think to myself, it's no wonder sometimes I feel so tired. There's an awful lot on my plate at times. But today I'm very pleased to run through a few thoughts, as well as some results of a bit of my own investigations and reflections on the area of Christian-Muslim relations. Let me see. Why is that not going? Here we are from the beginning. Right. So when I have worked on the history of Christian-Muslim relations, I've come up with this particular analysis that seems to me there are three fundamental dynamics that have been operating within the field of Christian-Muslim relations from very, very early on. And there's a mutuality to it. The first one is, of course, mutual antipathy, involving a competitive sense, each side calling the other a heretic in one way or another. So heresy has come into the picture. And the sense of negation, I'm right, you're wrong. Now, that's obviously a very superficial overview, but the point is that through the interaction over the years, there's been a lot of polemics, and that's just a fact. But the interesting thing, it's not just negative. The relationship between the two has also had the second element of mutual affinity, where there have been threads of respect. For example, beginning even with the whole motif of the Quran referring to Christians along with Jews as equally peoples of the book. Then you've got in the context of the early Islamic empires that really required Christians and Jews to be part of the organization or the running of the empires and so on. So Muslims had there were elements of a positive appreciation, albeit constrained sometimes by the antipathy. And so there are times through history of quite strong intercommunal harmony. It's been various, it's been variable in terms of its depth and so on, but the point is that affinity has been there along with antipathy. But there's yet another one, mutual inquiry. For example, both Muslims and Christians were interested in Muhammad's pre-prophethood travels and the part they played in his formation. There was the golden centuries of Muslim-ruled Spain, where as a result of positive interaction between Muslim and Christian scholars, that effectively enabled Europe's recovery of its classical heritage coming out of the Dark Ages. And of course, since the mid-20th century, there's been growing new dialogue, willingness, and opportunities on both sides. So that, in other words, there's been a mixture. It's not all negative. When we come to the point to reflecting on modern Christian Muslim engagement, the phrase that I've come up with this one, it's a case of, it seems to me, affinity and inquiry struggling with the inherent tendency to antipathy. It seems there have been many cases, I'm sure you're aware of them yourself, where just as some members of each faith engaging and expressing positive relations of one kind or another is equally from within each of the two religious communities, those who are skeptical, who are antipathetic, and even sometimes hostile. So affinity and inquiry struggling with inherent tendency to antipathy. And when we review the history of the modern period, if you like, from the early 20th century, the ecumenical movement that emerged opened up the whole question of a new approach. Christianity and other faiths took on a new kind of direction and appreciation. It wasn't all a matter of conversion. There were other kind of dimensions and dynamics involved. From after the Second World War, interreligious dialogue became much more an embedded element in the work of both the Roman Catholic Church through the Vatican and, of course, the World Council of Churches. And between those two, because the World Council of Churches embraces most world Christian communions, worldwide Christian communions, such as the Anglicans, the Reformed, and the Orthodox, between those two, the Vatican and the World Council of Churches, it really does embrace the great majority of Christians and their organizational structures in terms of churches, denominations, and so on. Certainly from the mid-20th century, we can say a new era of Christian-Muslim dialogue and relations emerged. In other words, there's been dimensions of this dialogue and relationship from the beginning, but there was a turn, a new development, a kind of a modern approach that began round about the mid-20th century. And that involved, of course, the formation of the World Council of Churches that quickly developed its dialogue subunit. It's interesting with both the Vatican and the World Council of Churches, there's been developments in understanding, and in that context developments in the way the structures are put in place to engage those relationships. So with the World Council of Churches, it became the Office of Interreligious Dialogue, then the Office of Interreligious Relations, then the Office of Interreligious Relations and Dialogue, and so on. And it's been a developing area, largely reflecting, though, shifts of understanding of what is possible. So there was early on a very enthusiastic engagement in dialogue, but then dialogue kind of reached not a stalemate, but it kind of reached a point where it seemed like we were going round and round in circles. And I've got some thoughts on that as to what happened and what needs to happen, and what has been happening, as we'll see momentarily. And then so the focus shifted from the dialogue of discourse to actual positive relations of engaging in what could be called, of course, the dialogue of life. And that's then they both were picked up together a bit later on, tried to be married together in some way. There was an interesting study program the World Council of Churches engaged in around the whole era of dialogue, which ran from soon after its inception to 1971. And that really did embed interreligious dialogue more generally in the life and work of the council. And but in 1960, we see there was a major consultation on Christian-Muslim dialogue. And in that, there was acknowledgement of the pervasive adverse effect upon Christian-Muslim relationships of long ingrained attitudes of prejudice and antagonism. Now, that was a statement which was true then, and of course it's true now, sadly, as we've seen with the attack that happened in Christchurch now coming up 2 years ago. But this consultation urged Christians to approach Muslims in a spirit of respect, friendship, and common yielding to the present voice of God. A deep and interesting challenge, and it's been picked up by many, and it's very clear that it's still very much a live challenge. Some issues that have emerged since the 1970s, some of which have been, most of them I think are still very much active. It's the acknowledgement of complementary themes, which become then a focus for the need for dialogue, the Christian missionary duty of evangelization alongside the Islamic imperative for dawah, for example. The cooperation for the well-being of humanity comes back into that dialogue of life dimension. But within that, there are some theological related topics, including the crisis of faith in general in the modern world, the place of Jesus Christ in Islamic faith and how that's understood and may relate to the Christian perspective, and of course Christian attitudes towards Muhammad, which can be highly variable, as we know. So there's still, I think, embedded in these particular topics is always the need for more and deeper education and dialogue within the communities about these things. In the mid-20th century, there was again a major Christian engagement issue with the Roman Catholic Church. The Second Vatican Council played a very important part in which resulted in the Secretariat for Non-Christians, later the Pontifical Council Interreligious Dialogue, and within that, the Islam Desk. But the big turn that happened within the Catholic Communion was, of course, the document of the Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, which did have a bearing on Christian-Muslim relations, because it asserted the salvific validity of Islam. The plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator in the first place, among whom are the Muslims. And so that was very significant. So it's only highlighting how around the middle of the 20th century, both the wider World Council of Churches and the significant Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church, both emerged into an era of engagement with Muslims in a totally new way. And that was also undergirded by Vatican II's documents on Christian-Muslim relations, or engaging Christian-Muslim relations along with others. Many of you will know this, of course, Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions, as it was called then. And again, asserting the high regard for Muslims, acknowledging the past, its negativity, but urging a sincere effort to be made to achieve mutual understanding. And so that's where I think that mutuality that I detected from very early on comes back into play, to see that we're actually picking up on motifs that have had a long-standing history. An interesting guiding motif that came from Pope John Paul II, he used this phrase of spiritual bond between Christian and Muslim as being an undergirding reality to draw the two faiths together in a new dynamic of relationship and dialogue. And the rationale for this dialogue was not for the reconciliation of specifics of belief, but nor seeking theological compatibilities, but rather to enhance a peaceful coexistence in the service of God together. The motif of religious duty of hospitality as a common heritage of Christian and Muslims was strongly undergirded and given a high priority, if you will. And I think that's fine. That's a good basic rationale for dialogue. I mean, rather we have a party together than actually try and kill each other, shall we say, enjoy each other's company and show respect, even though we may differ in many things. But there are still undergirding belief structures, dynamics that need to be addressed. So you have at 1994, the Catholic Church believes that the key dialogue is that which is carried out by Christians and Muslims who live, work, and study together in the same nation and society. Again, building on relationship, you can begin to then move into the question of engaging in a dialogue that looks at beliefs and self-understanding and how we actually appreciate one another. So all this activity of contrast, interchange, and deliberation is aimed at forming these two communities of faith who share life in so many parts of the world into becoming a force for peace and social harmony, for promoting human and divine values, and for defending the rights of the poor and voiceless. So that's here is the motif, shall we say, of justice comes through as again an undergirding element of the dialogue, because it is found in the thought world, the worldview of both religious traditions. As we move into the 21st century, there are some key markers that I think are worth taking note of. In the late 20th century, there was what I would call a dialogue stalemate that I alluded to a while ago. And that was, in that mix, there comes the rise of fundamentalisms within Christianity, within Islam, Fundamentalisms, by that I mean various developments that are pinned on or undergirded by a form of absolutism of their particular perspective. And so they can be problematic both within each religious tradition as well as between them. That kind of resurgence of a more intensive and aggressive form of religion accompanied the sense in which dialogue had reached a stalemate level, I think. And of course, at the opening of the 21st century, we have this great watershed of September the 11th, the 9/11 events, leading to, of course, this huge securitization of the world, really, in terms of the war against terror. You know, I mean, when you think back on it, if we can remember flying in the 20th century, I mean, you just went to the airport, you just got on your plane and you went from A to B. But since the last 2 decades, getting onto a plane becomes, you know, an incredible rigmarole of having to go through security and going through these now scanners and all sorts of things. And it all comes back to this war against terror, and it's shafted directly at the whole question of Islamic terrorism in the West. And yet, you know, I have my own thoughts about that. I think it's a bit. I actually think it's over the top now. I don't think that's the real issue, because we are seeing that it's not Islamic terrorism that is not necessarily the issue at all. But it certainly is in some parts of the world. But in other parts of the world, it's right-wing, either white supremacy or various forms of Christian extremism that is anti-Islam, which can be just as bad. But within on the positive side, the early 21st century, as a result of this watershed, saw within the community new forms of outreach and dialogical engagements. However, alongside that, we need to ask the question, is this an era of new fascism? And given what we've seen just lately in terms of global politics, not only just in America, of course, but elsewhere, one can't help but think that maybe this is part of our zeitgeist, our time, this kind of fascism with a hard secularism, evincing an antipathy to all religions, the religious extremism I've mentioned, and the assertive politics of the right. So things were looking a bit gloomy. However, in the 21st century, there have been 3 very significant dialogue initiatives, and this is where I want to just draw to a close in a moment. And you probably know all these, but just let's run over them briefly. The Building Bridges Seminar Series, which began in 2002. The Theologisches Forum Christentum Islam, that began in 2000. Well, its first formal meeting of Christians and Muslims was in 2005. It was initiated in 2002, and the first meetings happened in 3 and 4, and we'll come to those in a moment. Now, just a personal note here, in 2002, I had some study leave, 2 points of study leave, 2 months based in the UK and then 3 months based in Germany. And in that time, I was doing a study on Muslim-Christian relations, what was going on in Germany, particularly. So although I did not attend the Building Bridges seminar or the forum at that stage, I met with the people who were involved in setting them up, both in the UK and in Germany. And so became aware of these things evolving, and I've tracked them through ever since, kept an eye on, and I've attended certainly the German one on 2 or 3 occasions. But those were the 2 initiatives that came out very soon after 9/11. And then a few years later, of course, the Common Word invitation that emerged out of the Muslim world and has sparked, again, a whole series of engagements. So I see these as 3 very significant developments. And in them, they broke that sense of the stalemate, the dialogical stalemate that I referred to, particularly at the theological level, engaging in genuine theological discussion and so on. And both those first 2 have done that very intentionally. And the Common Word invitation was much broader, but nonetheless is part of the significant developments of the century. Just a brief word about Building Bridges. It was an Anglican initiative, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the aim there was the challenge to learn from the past and to build bridges of understanding for the future. kind of picking up on some of those motifs that were expressed in the round about the middle of the 20th century, when just as the World Council of Churches and the Vatican became engaged in Christian-Muslim relations. And the difference, though, is both with both the Building Bridges seminar and also the Christian-Muslim Forum in Germany, attendees are not sent as representatives of their particular faith. They are scholars with specialist input, but ecumenical in the sense that the Christians involved in building bridges can be of a variety of, shall we say, types of Christianity: Anglican, Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, and so on. So it's very ecumenical. And similarly with the Muslim attendees, that could be Sunni, Shia, from various parts of the world. They're there because they have expertise in the particular topic that is going to be addressed. And so hence you get a much higher and intentional level of intellectual engagement in that way. Nonetheless, as Rowan Williams, the Archbishop who took over from George Carey at the beginning, refers to the whole seminar series as an ongoing appreciative conversation. The aim is not to come up with declarations and those kind of reports that get embedded in an administrative system, but rather to continue a conversation, and out of that to provide to a wider community the resources of that. And I think that's been a feature of both the Building Bridges and the Christian Muslim Forum. And another element too, particularly with Building Bridges, is the methodology has involved all the way through the activity of reading scriptures together. And they reached a point about, I think it was about 10 years into the engagement, where you had then Muslims presenting on Christian scriptures and Christians presenting on Muslim scriptures, and engaging each other from that perspective. The underlying aim, of course, was to fill a gap of a lack of opportunity for serious, reflective, and fairly loosely structured encounter between Christian and Muslim scholars. So it's that level, that quite a different level of engagement, but I think plugs the gap that had emerged in the late 20th century. With the Christian Muslim Theological Forum in Germany, as I've indicated, an initiative of young scholars, and I met one of them in 2002 myself. The motivation for it, again, a dialogical engagement based and balanced and equal, and with drawing on expertise quite clearly from both sides. The goal being an academic theological dialogue in German language, and along with that, a contribution to the common life. As indicated in 2003 and 4, there were exploratory Christian-only conferences, and that was because there was an awareness of, at that stage, an imbalance. You had in the German system, of course, faculties of theology that were either evangelisch or Roman Catholic, and there was kind of a weight of Christians that could overwhelm Muslims, and so they carefully looked at how to begin, how to approach, how to develop, so that the Muslim side, shall we say, did not feel smothered. From 2005, the annual conferences of Muslims and Christians got underway, and within a few years, things had developed to the point where the conferences are now pretty much 50-50 Muslim and Christian, and a balance too of young and old, and a balance also of male and female coming in. So there's been quite strong intentionality involved in that process. When I've got a book coming out actually next month where I've engaged in a study of these two dialogue initiatives, and for myself I focused on what they had engaged in common in the first 10 to 15 years anyhow, so that you see that this gives an indication of the kind of topics that these two forms of dialogue have engaged in: scripture and prophecy, prayer, community of believers, ethics, justice. And so I focused on those ones in my book, but alongside that, Building Bridges has engaged in questions of humanity, death, science and religion, tradition and modernity, and by comparison, the ones that the Christian Muslim Theological Forum engaged in that is as yet building bridges hadn't, was questions of identity, suffering and pain, mission and conversion, and concepts of God. So, it gives a sense of the depth and breadth of what's been happening. And I suspect an awful lot of people in Christian churches and Muslim communities are not aware of this at all, which is a pity. But then you have the common word between us and you letter, which is the big Muslim contribution. And this letter is not very long, but there's a short summary with key points. And the critical one is this: the future of the world depends on peace between Muslims and Christians. That seems to be a bold statement, but it's still the case that between the two religions, we represent well over half of the world's population. And so the plea there was, we as Muslims invite Christians to come together with us on the basis of what is common to us, which is also what is essential to our faith and practice. And that was fundamentally love of God, love of neighbor. And so the substance of the letter is in three parts, reflecting those dimensions. There's you can go onto the websites and see the kind of responses that occurred early on. They were mixed, mostly positive. Some were a bit sort of skeptical, you might say, but significantly a whole series of colloquia, conferences, as well as the production of formal statements were generated by this letter, this invitation from the Vatican. The PCID Muslim letter clearly regards the reactionary and intransigent ideologies that drive terrorism, etc., not drawing on the whole of Islamic tradition, but rather a truncated and impoverished reading of it, reflecting that that the advent of this letter was seen, certainly by some, in the light of the war on terror, and at that stage very much the scrutiny that was being made of the Muslim world in respect to Islamism. The General Secretary of the World Council of Churches wrote the letter is most welcome and significant, and that is signed by such a large group of Muslim leaders and scholars from around the world. And so a lot of hope was generated by this. And significantly saying the World Council of Churches is ready to cooperate by participating in putting together a concrete process to implement what is being suggested. And that kind of work had been already underway, but it continues very intentionally even to this day. Rowan Williams himself reflected on the Muslim invitation as a powerful call to dialogue and collaboration. And he also noted the very wide geographical and theological diversity represented among the signatories, providing a unique impetus to deepen and extend the encounters. And I think, again, that's the significance of that is that always from the mid-20th century onwards, when there were gatherings of dialogue gatherings, generally they were attempted on the basis of representation, so that the different stakeholders, shall we say, ecumenical stakeholders in terms of the World Council of Churches and stakeholders that were being from the Muslim world, were invited to send in someone who was a representative. And that tended to sort of become problematic, because whereas the administrative structures of the Christian churches meant you could actually find and nominate and send someone as your representative, very often in the Muslim world it was not so easy, because the structures are different. And that's where imbalances started to appear. Whereas now with this letter on the Muslim side, there's been a big intentional drive to actually be as inclusive as possible from within the Muslim world, and that was significant. And of course, the Christian Century, the journal, basically saying that the fact of the letter itself is significant, and the economy of its argument. And this one too, the scholars resist the innate desire to touch on everything pertinent to Christian-Muslim dialogue, and instead invite Christians to remember Jesus' words about loving God and neighbor, the essential Torah, the essential message of the Quran and its focus on justice. And we're getting now to the end. So my conclusion here is that Christian-Muslim intention to engage is still very, very significant and strong, despite resistance, detraction, and criticism that has been the bugbear all the way through, you might say. There's very much a common intra-faith challenge, the task of bringing and keeping the faith communities on board. There is resistance and negativity, as we know, and certainly I've noticed it here in my own country as a result of, on the one hand, the positive engagement with the Muslim community from the government and from many churches in New Zealand after the Christchurch attack, and yet still some distinct expressions of negativity coming from other quarters. But the three initiatives that I've touched on in the 21st century, together, from my perspective, can be seen as a testimony and a resource. Very much the resource factor is, of course, the Building Bridges seminar and the Theological Forum each produce a book of out after each meeting, containing the essence of what it was they were doing and the resources that were drawn on. And so it becomes a resource for the wider community. And of course, the Muslim letters plea our common future is at stake. And I think that's deeply true. So in other words, the task of dialogue remains a priority. It's a never-ending task, and that is the way it is. And I think it's the way it should be. Thank you. That's it. Okay, so I come off sharing, don't I? No, I can stop sharing. There we are. Well, I raced through that because I wanted to have time for question and answers, but you might need a minute or two just to gather your thoughts and reflect on the input.
Douglas, thank you. Thanks ever so much for that. That was a very comprehensive overview of Christian-Muslim relations historically, but also currently too. I have quite a number of questions buzzing around, but I won't take over the platform. So I will let other colleagues ask first and then perhaps step in when there's an opportune moment. So colleagues, over to you. Who'd like to go first for a question or reflection? Oh, go on. Shall I go then? Shall I go first? Okay, I will then. Douglas, one initiative I noticed that wasn't on your list, and I'd be interested to know why you feel it wasn't on the list, or it may be an oversight, I don't know. But in 2016, we had the Marrakesh Declaration, which was on the anniversary of the Constitution of Medina, which, of course, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, put together. Now, one of the bugbears I have with a number of initiatives is either when they are launched, there's a huge amount of interest, a huge amount of publicity, and they work really well for a period of time, but then it sort of drops down and then people forget about them and then the world moves on. Secondly, that a number of these initiatives don't necessarily land at a community level. So it'll be at the level of theologians, but not necessarily congregation members, for example. And thirdly, a number of these initiatives, both faiths are guilty of this, will exclude women. So I just want your reflections on those, please. Okay,
well, about the Marrakesh one, no, you're right. I've come across that, but I hadn't actually studied it in depth as I had done the others. So those are the ones I focused on for today. But certainly, I mean, there are other initiatives that have been taking place, often regional, and because of the kind of other issues you mentioned, I mean, there have been issues. I'm not aware of the ones I've looked at. I'm not aware of ones that have excluded women, but maybe there are from what you're saying. But I do know that the question of women's involvement in dialogue has been one that's been raised from quite early on, and that was, I think, has been addressed particularly by the Building Bridges seminar and the Theological Forum. Certainly, well, for example, take the Theological Forum one. It was interesting. There was 3 people that started it, 2 men, 1 woman. That was just there with the interest group. But as the seminar or as that forum has evolved, there's been an intentional page to the question of gender balance and so on. And that's also happened within the appointments of professors in Germany. So there's been intentionality to overcome that tendency, which certainly was quite very evident, I guess, early on in the mid-20th century. I mean, when those groups met, it was pretty well all men, just the way it was. So I think it's the question of women in dialogue is certainly a live one and has been addressed and is by some, but where perhaps there's been exclusion, I think that is highly unfortunate, but it reflects still in both traditions a huge patriarchal undertow, shall we say, that continues to be there. And so yes, that itself is a topic. Yeah.
Thank you. Karima.
Yeah, thank you so much, Douglas, for that overview over history. So that was beautiful to have that all in one go. And I'd like to mention initiatives that I'm involved in. I think it can be interesting for everybody. And I think it's special also in a way. Our DML is involved in a Christian Islamic conference, which runs every year for 4 days since 35 years, and it's still on. So last year it was skipped because of the COVID, but otherwise every year, and this year we'll have something virtual. And yeah, this is a community-based event. So we try to bring people from the different strands of Muslim community, of Christian community. It's ecumenical. It has men and women very equally. And it also has children, youth, and elders. So it's intergenerational as well. So I think it's quite amazing community building, and it's been going on for 35 years. Every year, 4 days, 4 full days together, living together, services or spiritual elements together, lectures together, reflections and conversations together, creative elements, dance or calligraphy or whatever together. So it's quite broad also in what it does.
May I ask, Karima, how wide is this? Just in Germany, or is it something worldwide?
Yeah, it's a German one. It's a German one, all of Germany. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It took place in Bendorf.
You know, what I was going to say is that I'm certainly aware that it would take several volumes to cover, not only the global ones. Like I'm focused on ones that came out of those main areas, but also, and because they were the theological ones, but the kind of ones you're talking about, yes, I'm aware that in various regions and in countries, there's been quite a lot of intentional engagement of that nature. And that's good, but that's a whole other field to get into, to explore all that. But I think the fact, the fact that we know it happens, but we don't know much about them, whereas we know an awful lot about the negative stuff that comes through the media, is part of the problem. We somehow need to find a way of getting the word out and back to our own communities that it's not so unusual to engage in positive relations.
Exactly. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning, I'm totally aware that you were focusing on the theological ones, and so that's totally fine with me. I think it's just worthwhile that I make that comment because they are so long-term. It's like 30 years. Then there is another one, a Jewish Christian Muslim event. I think is also not so known, but it's 45 years going on. DML is also involved in that one. And there has been one for 20 years in Amerdown in the UK. And there is also the Christian Islamic Society, which has been around since 82. So that's also a long time, really. So I think that's quite remarkable also in today's time, that its last is not going down or is still here, it's alive, and so I think it's great. And I welcome all kinds of initiatives like that. Yeah. So I think it's amazing whenever people come together.
Sure. I'm also aware that in some cases, particularly I'm thinking here of the War of Bosnia Herzegovina back in the 90s, where although on the one hand, people said, well, you know, there'd been a time when Christians and Muslims and Jews in the area actually interacted quite well. All of a sudden it got literally blown out of the water, shall we say. But what is not necessarily widely known is that as a result of the good relations that had been there, the rebuilding was able to take place that much quicker, and the healing process, so that even though at times it may appear that all is lost, the fact of a history of engagement and people from each side, particularly leadership, having a deep interpersonal relation as a result of that kind of engagement, can actually play a strong part in ameliorating when things actually go awry and you have these disasters.
Thank you. Angelina.
Thank you so much, Professor Douglas Pratt. I'm so much appreciate your presentation and your deep thoughts. And also, I'm Orthodox. I graduated in the Ecumenical Council of Churches ecumenical program of master student, and also I specialized in Christian Muslim dialogue, especially Orthodox Muslim dialogue, and also would like to underline the Orthodox Muslim dialogue which was held in Shambhazi. I think there were 8 or 9 academic talks from 83 until 92, or I'm not sure about the years, but I was impressed about Metropolitan Damaskinus, who was the dean of the faculty in Shambhazi and one of the leaders in this Orthodox Muslim dialogue, who I will quote him, but not exactly. He was telling us that people came into dialogue as scholars, but they finished as friends. This is very important, these interpersonal relations.
Exactly.
Yes. I would like to underline this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my observations, that's certainly the case also with the Building Bridges seminar and the Theological Forum. And it's one of the, I think it's one of the, not so much the reward of the outcome, but of the dialogue, but actually is a very real and positive and appropriate outcome. In fact, if you'd have to say the dialogue had failed if you didn't end up as friends, because, you know, it means there was no real engagement. But I think the engagement that leads to a sense of we have different identities in terms of our religion, in terms of a lot of aspects really, but we can actually appreciate each other and respect each other and honor each other as a personal friend, I think is a great outcome, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Douglas, I'll give I guess a comment and then a point as well. One of the challenges, and I think it's a fair challenge, of interfaith work per se, is that often it can be like a club, group of people who know each other well and they speak to each other. Now, that's not necessarily wrong. There's not necessarily a problem with that. However, if that continues on an ongoing basis, it can become almost an echo chamber in its own right. If I give it an example, this afternoon, in fact, through my work at St. Philip's Centre, we had a Cross and Crescent group, which is our Christian Muslim dialogue group. So we had an imam and a parish priest who co-chair the group. And the challenge to both was bring people along to this dialogue who have never, ever attended this before. And out of the 25 people we had, at least 15 of them were congregation members from both communities, linked to the mosque, linked to the church. And it was a challenge that we set, but I think that's the kind of challenge that we need. We need to bring more people to the party from different places. In fact, some I would say would be, as you said earlier on, antipathetic to the whole thing. No, not doing it at all, don't want to go anywhere near it, hostile to it even. But I think there are greater rewards when you've turned somebody who's hostile into somebody who's a champion.
Yes, so you're right. That actually sounds a very good technique, and the premise is, of course, you have a core who have been meeting, who built that up, and so who can actually demonstrate the reality of it, and so people, yes, can be exposed. But I think that is a good response to the challenge. Yeah.
Marianne.
Yes, I'm with you too. to interest more people, and also those who never had a contact to this. But I think the first is we have to engage the young people and to go to the schools and to go. So here we have a group of Jewish, Christian, and Muslims who are running a project to go to schools and to introduce themselves, to discuss with the students. And I think this is much more effective than because they go out, than always to be in closed clubs.
Yes. No.
And then you can invite them also to a club or to a community where they can engage themselves if they want.
Exactly. No, I fully agree with that, and I do know that elements of that are happening in all sorts of parts of the world because of the recognition that if we don't bring the younger generation on board, then everything we're back to square one, really. Yeah, no, that's very good.
Douglas, I have a really good example. You've, of course, been to St. Philip's, you know the centre quite well. And sorry, colleagues, I will come to you for questions. I've just got a really good story to tell you. So next door to where St. Philip's Centre is based is St. Philip's Church. And about 5 years ago, the church was broken into. And it was horrific what happened, broken into. Crosses were smashed in half. Tables, which the founding fathers and mothers of that church organized their meetings on, were broken. These were the table was the meeting where this church was set up. So huge historical artifacts smashed to bits. Within 24 hours of that damage, a group of about 20 young Muslims, never even walked into that church before, heard about this in the newspapers, gathered together and helped clean up the church within 24 hours.
Mm.
Quite amazing.
Yeah. No, it's amazing, but also encouraging that can be the response. Yeah. No, thank you for that.
Marlies.
Yes, I think you could, and I'm going to hold this up.
Oh yeah, the sharing, Mary. Thank you.
I've been talking to Douglas about this. We thought to engage people on the congregational level, students and even children. It's good to go back to the stories which the Bible and the Quran have in common. That really is a common word there. And it's fascinating, and it's also emotionally very satisfying to see and read the stories we grew up with, like Noah and the Ark, like Jonah and the big fish, of course, Mary and Jesus, that they are in the Quran as well.
Yes.
And to make this more accessible, we made this anthology of Quran and Bible stories, and just putting the texts side by side, so you can pick out any story you favor at that minute, and you can actually follow step by step how these stories develop in these two holy books. And we're a long way away from fighting each other, or a long way away from theological hair splitting, which for ordinary people, they don't know what's going on. Get back to the people in the Bible and the Quran who we all know about. We just didn't know that the other side also knew them.
No, thank you for that, Marlies. You're right. That is certainly one very good way to draw in, I think, shall we say, lay folk from both sides, because you bring in the stories, and you can see and just take your engagement from that starting point. So, but when I saw your cover, I realized I have seen your book, but I don't know if I've got it. My saying I don't know if I've got it, I have an Islamic studies library of my own, but it's on the campus. And lately we've been locked out of going on the campus with the fluctuating levels. So I'm waiting to get back to it. But I don't think it's there, but I think I've seen it. So thank you.
Yes, and so we have on the front, we have the two Marys. We have the Islamic Mary and the Christian Mary. So people think the book is about Mary. It is about Mary and Jesus, but it's also about Adam and Eve, Adam and Hava. You know, it's about Abraham. It's about Moses being there in the river, you know, as a baby. All these lovely stories, we share them already.
Thank you.
Colleagues, I'll take a question from Tobias. I know he had a question. We are slowly coming to the end of the formal part of the session, after which we can hand over to colleagues at URI Europe, and then we could perhaps pause the recording, and if Douglas, you have 10 minutes or so, we can probably continue for a little bit longer if that's okay. Tobias, over to you.
Just thank you, Ravat. Thank you, Douglas. I'm just reporting a thing because I'm a member since 6 years of the Theologisches Forum, of the organizational team, and I was very happy of you speaking about it. Of course, so we had a change. I think that was interesting because after nearly 10 years of getting to know each other more and more, so what Pope Benedict told the face-to-face way of knowing each other, talking about prophets, talking about God, we changed the perspective a little bit to the side-by-side perspective. So we looked at the societal, political, but also philosophical topics we share. And since I think 5 years, it works very well with this perspective. My question would be just sorry for it's quite egoistic to ask, but what kind of topics do you see in your work talking together which connects us or which we can discuss? So we're always open to have new topics.
Well, I think what you described to me is it's interesting because there's a sense in which a good dialogue relationship is not unlike the relationship of two lovers who come together. Initially, you're gazing into each other's eyes and you're looking at each other, talking at each other. And then you reach a point in the relationship where you establish that sense of I'm okay and you're okay, we can work together. And we then are looking out, what's ahead of us, where we're going. And in the context of, I mean, that's an analogy. So in the context, I think, of Christian-Muslim dialogue, there needs to be a mixture of both. If you're always focused on looking at each other in terms of trying to resolve the unresolvable, shall we say, then you reach a stalemate. If you end up focused only on sort of external matters, like you know, child poverty, shall we say, or issues of communal relations, and not attend to the underpinning theological perspectives, then that ends up sort of drifting away from, or the risk is of drifting away from the religious roots that undergird and drive it. And that's when you know, the risk is of well, the extremisms that we've talked about that slip in and take over in some quarters. So I think, but in my coming back to your number of your question, looking ahead, what are issues? It seems to me at the moment, you know, we are faced with not only the question of how do we respond to a pandemic, but also more particularly, how do we respond to the political, social, and religious ideologies that are actually working to tear us apart, to actually becoming, you know, strongly mutually exclusive rather than inclusive. In fact, my comment lately has been that at the moment the world is confronted with two viruses, the biological virus and the ideological virus, and both, if unaddressed, will end up undermining and destroying us. So that you've got the ideological focus, but you've also got, from time to time, often very much in a local situation, very specific issues. I can remember, for example, some years ago, I used this kind of phrase, Mormons, Muslims, and Methodists all came together to fight the establishment of a casino, because they could see how a casino in this town would undermine their communities. Well, you know, in other words, the various exotic religions, Mormonism, the Christian communities, as well as the Muslim communities, found that they each had a concern about people and a value structure that said we want to fight this, and that became, you know, a focal cause that they could all work on. I think those kind of local things will come up and continue to come up, so it's that mixture, I think, in the fullness of relationship. Yeah. Well,
thank you, Douglas. Over to Karima. Thank you all of you for attending.
Yeah. Yes, thank you also from my side to Douglas for your excellent talk, and to everybody for your contributions and for thinking together, being together, sharing. Finally, I would like to say a few words about URI as a co-organizer. So URI is a global network. It's a grassroots interfaith network, and it's in over 100 countries of the world. I think in 108 countries and over 1,000 groups. So I would like to make sure you know what it is if you are drawn to international interfaith work, and if you would like to partner or join. So the member organizations are organizations. It's not individual. Not recently we have an individual membership program, so it's possible to become a member as an individual. Let's say the full members are the groups or organizations, and as an organization, one need to have at least 7 people of 3 different traditions, or religions, or spiritual expressions, or even indigenous traditions. Yeah, so, and last but not least, I'd like to say that URI has a consultant status with the United Nations, and it has a strong youth branch, as we can see from Daniel, who was part of that, but now he's also on the board of URI Europe. So there is a strong youth movement in URI as well. Others, Mira is also very much involved in it, and Leila, Angelina. So our last talk in the series will be on Friday. In 2 days' time, we'll have Professor Nargis Nurullah Khojeva from Tajikistan, who teaches at the university in Moscow in Russia. And she will speak about a pertinent topic also, hearing the other with the ears of the heart, resilience in our pandemic time, and my neighbors. So hearty invite to all of you to join us then. It will be at 5 o'clock Central European time. And yeah, and it's also nice. Thank you, Douglas, for coming to us early morning, 8 o'clock your time, right after breakfast. Yeah. And you can see Douglas is already 1 day ahead of us. For him, it's already 25th of February, and we'll follow you, Douglas. So thank you once again. And with that, I'll stop the recording, and who wants could still stay a little bit longer if there is the wish.